I probably don't need to tell anyone in this room that our world is in peril. We are facing mass extinction at a global scale, and more locally, in every locale that I can think of, we have extremities in terms of all the ways in which weather patterns are becoming more severe and less predictable, and also, of course, with a general trend toward warming. This has resulted in a lot of effort to adapt. Climate adaptation really is a large part of the conversation right now when people talk about climate change. And when they talk about adaptation, what people tend to talk about is infrastructure, bridges, tunnels, cities as a whole, and how they become less livable as storms come through, wildfires, and all the various other sorts of phenomena that are driven by climate change. But it seems to me that there's another sort of infrastructure that is at least as significant when we consider climate change and the consequences that we are already experiencing now and that we will experience to an even greater extent going forward. And that is at the cultural level, at the level of how people get along in the world, how communities are able to cohere in increasingly stressful times, how we can avoid warfare and all the various other ways in which, when we face food and water insecurity, for instance, we tend to make enemies instead of friends. And that just is not going to work. So thinking about that and thinking about infrastructure, I started to think about a sort of a cultural infrastructure that we might potentially address in the same ways or similar and with at least as much seriousness as we do bridges, tunnels, and all the hard infrastructure that is increasingly threatened by all the phenomena that I mentioned earlier. When we think about cultural and communal cohesion, food is really essential. It really is central at the level of the flavors that we know, the ways that we cook, the rituals around the table. And yet, one of the real dilemmas or problems is that our heritage cuisine typically is made from ingredients that grow locally. We, of course, have globalized in every possible way in recent times, but when we think about the foods that are really traditional to a place, they are very much based on the ingredients that have grown there, often for a very long time. And of course, if the climate is changing, they aren't going to grow necessarily where they grew before. It's going to become increasingly a problem, in other words, for people to sustain their cultural heritage when we think of cuisine as central to it. So I've been working on a project for the past couple of years with scientists at the University of Arizona, University of Maryland, University of North Carolina State University, and several other institutions, where we're looking at what are known as climate analogs. So a climate analog is essentially a map. And this is a mapping, perhaps would be a better way to put it. It is a mapping that is indicating where in the world in, say, 50 years, you would expect to find the climate where you are presently located. Or more often, it's the opposite. That is to say, if you want to understand how the place where you live today will be in 50 or 100 years, or whatever number it might be, this is a method that uses climate modeling in the traditional sense, and then looks to locations throughout the world based on what the model indicates to be able to create these analogs. So what I have been working on with these scientists is to think about this method in terms of food. and to think about how that might be a tool or a method or a means by which to sustain heritage cuisine in the face of climate change. In other words, if you think about the foods that you know, you may not still be able to access the ingredients that are used traditionally in those foods, but there might be substitutes, and it will take time and effort to be able to figure out what those are, how to cultivate them, how to cook with them, and the sort of resilience that is core to this quality of adaptation, this need for adaptation, really depends on starting now a process of working out these sorts of substitutions. So using the climate modeling that we have available to us through the work being done at the University of Maryland, we've been working on creating these sorts of matches that can provide a basis for learning ingredients, learning about them in terms of their flavors and other qualities, and also gaining a sense of know-how in terms of how to cultivate and how to use them, which can be really important. One of the ingredients that we were looking at relatively early on in the explorations that we were making is an ingredient that is known as the desert yam. The desert yam is found in Australia, certain parts of the middle of the country. And that's a place that is pretty hot and pretty dry. Really kind of a place that might anticipate, for instance, Tucson, Arizona, which is where the University of Arizona is based. Now, the thing about the desert yam is that it is kind of dangerous, deadly specifically, if you don't know what to do with it. Namely, that you need to soak it in a river for several days in order to leach out the toxins. So that is just one example, a cautionary tale perhaps if anyone in the room was planning to have desert yam for dinner tonight, probably to hold off for a few days of soaking it before getting around to that meal. But it also, I think, is more generally a way in which to think about and to talk about the challenges that come up when we start to think about how to substitute ingredients in order to be able to sustain the cuisine that we know. So we've been running experiments, and these experiments are social as much as they are culinary and scientific in the sense of developing the climate models and developing the means by which to use them effectively. We've been working initially in Tucson, which is where the University of Arizona is based and where I am based as a research associate, but it's also where our ecologist is based, and as a result, where we know an awful lot about the food and the ingredients, and also where we happen to have a very strong relationship with a James Beard-winning master chef who is very familiar with those ingredients and with the cuisine. So what you're looking at on the screen here actually is one of the maps that we produced. It's a map that shows what climate, where the climate of, the places that now have the climate that Tucson, Arizona will have in the year 2080. And as you can see, there's Australia there, and then there's also part of Europe. And you can see here a little bit more, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong slide. So it is also parts of northern India and Pakistan. So you can see here a close-up of the latter, the region in northern India, Pakistan, where we can expect to, where we need to look if we are to find the ingredients that we might be able to use in Tucson. We've also been looking at it in the opposite direction. Namely, we've been looking at it in terms of Tucson and where the cuisine currently found in Tucson, the ingredients found in Tucson, where those ingredients might grow in the year 2080 in order then to be able to adapt those foods based on ingredients that Janos Wilder, our chef, knows very well. And you can see on this map a mapping of several places, one of which is in Europe, especially in Spain around Burgos. So we got in touch with people in Burgos through the network that Tucson is also a part of, which is the UNESCO Cities of Gastronomy. And we found out what the heritage cuisine is. And there's one dish in particular that keeps getting mentioned, and that is olla podrida, which is a mix of many things, but one that is particularly important, particularly central to it, is the Spanish red bean. So Spanish red beans are most likely not going to be on the menu in the year 2080. But when we look at beans, we find a really remarkable bean in the Sonoran Desert, which is where Tucson is located, which is known as the tepary bean. And it's kind of this bean that can grow in the most arid conditions, in the hottest climate that you could, well, I wouldn't say that you can possibly imagine. That seems like it might be jinxing something. But it grows in remarkably hot and arid places, including the climate that people in Burgos might expect. So we remade the olla podrida using that ingredient. And we also looked at blood sausage, which is served often in or with the olla podrida. And we looked at rice, which is the binding agent used in blood sausage, and is, of course, very water intensive. And instead of rice, we ended up using Sonoran white wheat berries, which, ironically enough, come from Spain by way of colonialism, by way of adjusting, evolutionarily speaking, through cultivation to the weather in the Sonoran Desert. And that allowed us to then remake olla podrida using these alternative ingredients and to show what that would be like, to have a public presentation about that would give people a taste of tomorrow. So you're probably wondering by now what's happening here. What can you expect in Germany, in Munich in particular? And Munich is predicted, according to these climate models, in the year 2080 to have the climate that is currently found in Trentino in Italy. Berlin will have the climate of southern Romania. Much of Germany will have the climate of Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Italy. And if you want to consider from the opposite end of it, the Schleswig-Holstein part of Germany is in fact what will be experienced in parts of Norway in the year 2080. So what we're looking to do here is to assist this adaptation, but I think that there's another dimension that is at least as important, which I alluded to using that term, tasting tomorrow. When we talk about climate and climate change, we often are looking at charts, data. They're inscrutable to most people. So I think that there's a potential to get a gut feeling for what is in store and potentially to motivate action on the basis of food, on the basis of foods that are similar but not exactly the same. So what we have been doing is we've been developing in places around the world public events, and we recently had one in the Yucatan in Mexico, and I hope that we'll be able to have one in Munich in the not too distant future. We're also working with the Goethe Institute on a methodology for workshops where people can make future-proof cookbooks, where they take their heritage cuisine and we work with them to have a sort of an heirloom they can pass on to the next generation that will allow the next generation still to have some essential sense of the flavors that people know, but really also is about creating those intergenerational relationships that are so vitally important in terms of motivating action and sustaining it. Finally, what we're looking at is how to scale this. And that really means making it global, but also making it local everywhere. And that's where we're starting to work on an app. Basically, the idea of this app is to show people ingredients for wherever they are that they might be able to use in the future and that they could already start today to experiment with. And this becomes a way in which to build a network. And I see this not only as a network of knowledge and of know-how, but also a network of sharing and of generosity. And that generosity probably is going to be the single most important attribute, which is an attribute that really comes from what happens around the table. And it's an attribute that I think can be cultivated through the act of sharing ingredients, sharing know-how, and sharing our foods with each other, which I very much hope is one of the consequences of Tasting Tomorrow.